The silence in the valley was a heavy blanket, the kind you'd use to smother a fire. Snow fell in thick, quiet sheets, burying the world. And inside a crooked little cabin, Caroline May was being buried right along with it. She lay crumpled by the hearth, the last few embers painting a sick orange glow on the purple and green bruises blooming across her face. Each breath she took was a tiny, ragged tremor, a thread. And she knew that thread was about to snap. Her two kids, Emma and Luke, were huddled against her, their small bodies trembling. They didn't cry. They'd learned a long time ago that tears only made it worse. Instead, they just watched their mother's chest rise and fall, praying to a God they weren't sure was listening anymore. Caroline's world was slipping into shadow and spark. She was so tired of the pain, of the fear, of Roy Cutter's whiskey breath and sour fists. She'd been beaten down until her soul was as bruised as her body. And tonight, she could feel herself letting go. Just let it be over, she thought. A small hand shook her shoulder, frantic. "Mama," Emma whispered, her voice tight with a terror no 8-year-old should ever know. "Please don't sleep yet. Please." Caroline tried to answer, to promise her little girl she'd stay. But her throat was ash. Her strength was gone. All she could manage was a flicker of her fingers against her daughter's wrist. A goodbye. Then the cabin door groaned. It wasn't Roy's familiar angry shove. This was different. Slower. The door swung open, and a figure blocked the entrance, a giant silhouette framed by the swirling snow and the pale moonlight. He was carved from the mountain itself, tall and impossibly broad, with snow dusting his wild hair and dark, steady eyes that seemed to soak in the whole broken room in a single glance. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The silence that came with him was heavier than any storm. Luke whimpered, burying his face deeper into his sister's coat. Emma froze, her tiny body a shield. Caroline forced her swollen eyes open, a new kind of fear, sharp and cold, cutting through the fog of her pain. She knew this man, not really. She'd seen him once, maybe twice, in town. The mountain man, Jedediah Boone, a hermit, a ghost story parents told their kids. And now he was in her house. He stepped inside, shutting the door softly against the wind, and the room fell into a hush. His eyes took in everything. The broken chair in the corner, the spilled food on the floor, the two terrified children, and her, the bruised, broken woman by the dying fire. For a second, his hands, calloused and scarred from a life of hard work, clenched into fists. Then, just as quickly, they relaxed. He set down a small pack without a sound and knelt by the hearth. He didn't look at her again. He just took a log from the pile and gently fed the embers, coaxing them back to life. Flame licked the wood, and a small bit of warmth began to push back the cold. Emma stared, her fear tangled with a strange, forbidden curiosity. She held Luke tighter, her knuckles white. She had seen men be cruel. She had seen men be loud. She had never, not once, seen a man be quiet. She had never seen a man kneel. Jedediah reached into his coat and pulled out a clean strip of cloth. He dipped it in the kettle of warm water hanging over the fire, wrung it out, and then he did something that shattered Caroline's world. He reached for her. She flinched, a lifetime of violence coiled in her muscles. But his touch was nothing like Roy's. It was unbelievably gentle. He dabbed the warm cloth against her split lip, his movements slow, deliberate. It was a kindness so unexpected, so foreign in that house of pain, that it hurt more than any blow she'd ever taken. He said nothing. But his silence was a language all its own. It wasn't the silence of indifference, like the sheriff in town. It wasn't the silence of fear, like her own. This was the silence of purpose. A storm held back, and as he cleaned the blood from her face, Caroline May felt something shift inside her. A tiny, fragile flicker in the darkness. Hope. But with that hope came a terrifying question. Why? Why was this stranger here? What did he want? For 2 days, the cabin became a strange sanctuary. Jediah Boone moved with the quiet patience of the seasons, his presence a steady anchor in the storm of Caroline's life. He came and went like a shadow, sometimes disappearing into the blizzard for hours, only to return with a freshly caught rabbit or a stack of perfectly split firewood. He never asked for anything. He never explained himself. He just did. He mended the broken chair. He patched the drafty wall. He melted snow for clean water. The children watched him, their fear slowly melting away like ice in the spring sun. Luke, who hadn't spoken a word in a week, eventually found the courage to stand near him as he worked. Jediah didn't try to talk to him. He just reached down, his hand big as a dinner plate, and rested it gently on the boy's head. A silent promise. You are safe here. Caroline healed. The bruises on her skin began to fade from angry purple to a dull, mottled yellow, but the wounds inside were deeper. She watched this silent giant, this ghost from the mountains, and she couldn't understand him. Men took. Men hurt. Men demanded. This man only gave. One afternoon, as he was splitting wood outside, his back muscles moving like thick ropes under his worn shirt, she felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. It was a dangerous feeling, one she had buried long ago. She hated herself for it. But when he came inside and brushed a bit of snow from her shoulder, his touch so brief and impersonal, yet so shockingly gentle, her breath caught in her throat. The peace, however, was a fragile thing, a thin sheet of ice over a deep, dark river. On the third night, it shattered. Heavy, drunken footsteps crunched outside. The latch rattled violently, the door burst open, and Roy Cutter filled the frame, his face a mask of rage, his breath a foul wave of cheap whiskey. "What's this?" he slurred, his eyes wild and bloodshot. They swept the room, taking in the mended chair, the clean floor, the warm fire, and then they landed on Jediah. Roy's lip curled into a sneer. "Mountain vermin. Crawled right into my home, huh? Think you can take what's mine?" Caroline's blood ran cold. The children scrambled behind her, their newfound safety gone in an instant. Jediah rose to his feet. He didn't seem to hurry, but somehow he was standing between them and Roy before the man had taken a second step. He stood tall, his hands open and empty at his sides. "She's not yours to break," Jediah said. His voice was the first thing she'd heard from him that was more than a murmur. It was deep, calm, and carried the weight of the mountain he came from. Roy laughed, a nasty, broken sound. He staggered forward, his hand going to his belt. "She's mine," he snarled, pulling a long, wicked-looking knife. "Always has been, and no flea-bitten hermit is gonna tell me different." He lunged. But Roy was drunk and slow. Jediah was not. He moved with a speed that seemed impossible for a man his size. He didn't dodge. He didn't back away. He stepped in. With one hand, he caught Roy's wrist, twisting it with brutal efficiency. The knife clattered to the floorboards. With the other hand, he grabbed the front of Roy's shirt and slammed him back against the wall. The whole cabin shook. "Enough," Jediah said, his voice no longer calm. It was a low growl, the sound of rocks grinding together. Roy struggled, cursing and spitting, but he was a child in the mountain man's grip. Jediah didn't hit him. He didn't choke him. He just held him there, pinned and powerless, his eyes burning with a cold, controlled fire. Caroline watched, her hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. She had dreamed of this moment, prayed for it, but she never imagined it would look like this. Not a bloody brawl, but a quiet, absolute dismantling of the monster who had haunted her life. Roy's drunken rage dissolved into whimpering fear. Jediah held him a moment longer, then shoved him toward the door. "Get out," Roy stumbled, catching himself on the doorframe. He glared back, his eyes full of hate. "You'll pay for this!" he spat, his threat aimed at Caroline. "Both of you!" Then he was gone, swallowed by the night and the snow. The silence he left behind was deafening. Jedediah bent down, picked up the knife, and with a single powerful movement, drove it deep into the floor. It stood there, quivering, a monument to the violence that would no longer rule this house. Emma's small voice broke the stillness. "Will he come back?" Jedediah turned, and the hardness in his face softened as he looked at the little girl. "Not tonight," he said. But Caroline knew better. Roy was a coward, but he was a vengeful one. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. And now, this kind stranger, this quiet protector, was tangled up in her mess. A new fear took root in her heart, colder than any that had come before. Roy hadn't just been defeated, he had been humiliated. And a man like Roy Cutter would never, ever let that go. The days that followed were filled with a tense, fragile peace. Jedediah stayed. He never said he would, he just was. A constant, silent presence that kept the darkest fears at bay. He taught Emma how to track rabbits in the snow. He carved a small wooden bird for Luke, who carried it everywhere. He and Caroline fell into a rhythm that didn't need words. They worked together, maintaining the small cabin, their movements a quiet dance of survival. But under the surface, the fear simmered. Every gust of wind sounded like footsteps. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Caroline found herself watching Jedediah, studying the scars on his knuckles, the deep lines around his eyes. He was a man who knew hardship, a man who knew violence. But there was a sadness in him, too. A deep, ancient sorrow she couldn't name. One evening, as they sat by the fire, the children sleeping soundly for the first time in years, she finally found her voice. "He'll be back," she said, her words barely a whisper. Jedediah didn't look at her. He just stared into the flames, his big shoulders slumped slightly. "I know." "He'll bring trouble," she continued. "He won't come alone next time. You should go. This isn't your fight." He was silent for a long time. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the howl of the wind outside. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with an emotion she couldn't place. "I can't go." "Why?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy and desperate. He turned to look at her then, and for the first time, she saw past the stoic protector. She saw the man underneath. His eyes were filled with a pain that mirrored her own. "Because I've run from a fight like this once before," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "A long time ago. My sister, she was married to a man like Roy." Caroline's breath hitched. He had a sickness in him, a cruelty that came out with the drink. I told myself it was family matters, that it wasn't my place to meddle, the way the whole town did. He reached into his shirt and pulled out a small, tarnished silver locket on a leather cord. He opened it. Inside, there was no picture, just a single pressed violet, faded with time. "I was young, scared. I left. Went up into the mountains to get away from the screams I could hear even in my sleep. By the time I came back, it was too late." The story fell into the silence of the cabin, each word a heavy stone. This wasn't charity. This wasn't pity. This was penance. "I won't run again, Caroline," he said, his gaze meeting hers, intense and unwavering. "Not this time." At that moment, something inside her broke free. The dam of years of unshed tears, of unspoken pain, finally burst. She sobbed, raw and ragged, for the woman she had been, for the life that had been stolen from her, and for this broken man who was trying to save her soul as much as his own. The thaw came, not in the weather, but in Caroline. With Jedediah's story hanging between them, The last of her walls crumbled. The silence in the cabin was no longer one of fear or uncertainty. It was a shared space of healing. She started to talk. Small things at first. Memories of her father, of a childhood before Roy. Jediah would listen, his head cocked slightly, his gaze never leaving her face. He didn't offer advice or empty platitudes. He just listened. And in his listening, she found a validation she had never known. But their fragile peace was living on borrowed time. One morning, Jediah returned from checking his traps along the ridge, his face grim. "Someone's been up here," he said, his voice tight. "Two men, on horseback. They weren't hunting." Caroline's heart plummeted. Roy. And someone else. The tracks were fresh. He looked around the small cabin, his eyes calculating. They were scouting, seeing if I was still here. He's planning something. The fear was back, sharp and acidic. But this time, it was different. It wasn't the paralyzing terror she had lived with for years. It was a cold, hard anger. This was her home. These were her children. She would not let that monster drag them back into the dark. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice steady. A flicker of something, surprise, respect, crossed Jediah's face. "We get ready," he said, and so they did. Jediah was no longer just a protector. He became a teacher. He brought out his rifle, a long, heavy piece of oiled steel and dark wood. He showed her how it worked, how to load it, how to aim, how to breathe, slow and steady, before squeezing the trigger. The first time she held it, its weight felt alien and terrible in her hands. "I can't," she whispered, her arms trembling. "You can," he said, his voice firm but gentle. He stood behind her, his large hands guiding hers, his presence a warm, solid wall at her back. "You're stronger than you think, Caroline. He just made you forget it." Day after day they prepared. Jediah taught her the ways of the mountain, how to move without making a sound, how to use the terrain to her advantage. They barricaded the single window with thick planks. They reinforced the door. Emma and Luke helped, their small faces serious, gathering rocks to pile against the walls. They were no longer just victims. They were a family, a fortress. One afternoon, while securing the roof, Jediah found something tucked under a loose shingle, a small, leather-bound journal. It was old, the pages yellowed and brittle. "This yours?" he asked, holding it out to her. She shook her head. "It must have belonged to the people who built this place." Curiosity got the better of them. That night, by the fire, she read from it aloud. It was the diary of a woman who had lived there a generation ago, a homesteader's wife. She wrote of the harsh winters, the loneliness, the brutal work. But she also wrote of a secret. A small fortune, her husband's life savings from his days as a gold miner, hidden somewhere in the cabin. "He feared banks and bandits more than God," Caroline read, her voice hushed. "So he put his trust in stone and shadow, beneath the heart of the home," he said, "where the fire is always warm." They looked at each other, then at the stone hearth. It was just a story, a ghost tale from a forgotten diary. But then Caroline remembered something. The way Roy was always tearing at the floorboards near the fireplace. The way he would fly into a rage when he found nothing. He hadn't just been beating her. He'd been looking for something. "Oh my God," she breathed. He knew. He knew about the money. The cruelty suddenly made a new, terrible kind of sense. It wasn't just mindless rage. It was a calculated campaign of terror, designed to break her, to drive her out, so he could tear the cabin apart and find the gold. This land, this cabin, it had been in her family for generations. Roy had married her for it, for the secret he thought it held. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Her entire life with him had been a lie, a brutal, violent treasure hunt. The attack came at dawn. A faint gray light was just beginning to touch the snow-covered peaks when the sound of horses echoed through the valley. Jedediah was already awake, his rifle in his hands. "They're here," he said, his voice calm. "Get the children to the back room. Stay away from the door." Caroline's heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands were steady as she took the second rifle he passed to her. She ushered a sleepy Emma and Luke into the small bedroom, piling blankets against the door. "Stay down, and don't make a sound, no matter what you hear," she whispered, kissing them both. She returned to the main room just as the first voice cut through the morning air. It was Sheriff Jenkins. "Jedediah Boone, this is the law. You come on out of there. You're under arrest for kidnapping." A cold laugh bubbled in Caroline's throat. Kidnapping. That's the story Roy had spun. "He's got my wife and kids in there!" Roy's voice shouted, thick with false panic. "He's a crazy mountain man!" "There are 4 of them," Jedediah murmured, peering through a tiny crack in the wall. "Sheriff, Roy, and 2 others I don't recognize. Drunks from town, probably." "What do we do?" Caroline asked, her knuckles white on the stock of the rifle. "We wait," he said. "They don't want to storm the cabin. They're cowards. They want to scare us out." For an hour, it was a stalemate. They shouted threats. They fired a few shots into the air, but they didn't approach. The cabin, once her prison, was now her shield. Then, Roy got impatient. "Burn him out!" he screamed. Caroline saw a flicker of movement. One of the men was creeping toward the side of the cabin with a lit torch. "The west wall," Jedediah said, his voice deadly calm. "You see him?" Caroline peered through another crack. She saw him. A big bearded man, his face illuminated by the flame. Her breath caught. This was it. "Remember what I taught you," Jedediah said softly. "Breathe. Aim for his shoulder. You don't have to kill him. Just make him stop." She raised the rifle. The weight felt familiar now. Solid. She lined up the sight, the man's shoulder in her crosshairs. She took a breath, and she squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked back hard against her shoulder, the explosion deafening in the small space. Outside, the man screamed and dropped the torch, clutching his arm. The torch sputtered and died in the snow. A stunned silence fell over the valley. No one had expected the woman inside to fight back. From the back room, a small cry escaped. "Luke." The sound spurred Roy into a fresh frenzy. "She shot at us! They're trying to kill us! Get in there!" He charged the door, his body slamming against the reinforced wood. The other men followed, their fear replaced by mob anger. They threw themselves against the door, the wood groaning, the barricade starting to splinter. Jedediah moved to the door, his rifle ready. "Stay back, Caroline." But she didn't. She moved to stand beside him, her own rifle raised. They were going to break through. It was only a matter of time. Suddenly a new sound cut through the chaos. A voice. A child's voice. "Leave my mama alone!" The back room door flew open. Emma stood there, her small face streaked with tears, but her eyes blazing with a fire that could melt steel. In her hands, she held the old leather-bound journal. "It's not his house!" she screamed, her voice piercing the air. "It was my grandpa's, and he's a thief!" The assault on the door stopped. Everyone, inside and out, froze. Sheriff Jenkins, his face a mixture of confusion and annoyance, stepped forward. "What's that, little girl?" Emma strode into the middle of the room, her small frame radiating a courage that shamed every man outside. "He's been looking for the gold!" she shouted, holding up the journal. "Grandpa's gold! He told Mama he loved her, but he was just looking for the gold! I heard him telling his friends in town." The accusation hung in the cold morning air, sharp and undeniable as a shard of glass. Roy's face went white. "She's lying. The kid's crazy, just like her mother." But the sheriff was looking at Roy now, a new, calculating expression in his eyes. The story of a crazy mountain man was one thing. A treasure hunt, a motive for years of documented abuse. That was something else entirely. Something that made a lot more sense. Gold? The sheriff asked, his voice slow and deliberate. What gold? Jedediah saw his opening. The gold hidden under the hearthstone of the cabin her father built, he said, his deep voice carrying easily through the splintered door. The cabin and the land that belonged to her, the land he's been trying to take. Roy panicked. He shoved the sheriff aside and lunged for the door again, his eyes wild. It's mine! She's my wife! Everything she has is mine! This time, when the door shuttered under his weight, it wasn't Jedediah who met him. It was Caroline. She stepped forward, her face a mask of cold, hard fury. All the years of pain, of fear, of humiliation, coalesced into a single, blinding point of strength. It was never yours, she said, her voice ringing with a power no one had ever heard from her before. And she fired the rifle, not at him, not at anyone. She fired it straight up into the ceiling. The blast echoed like a thunderclap. Splinters rained down. Roy stumbled back, his ears ringing, his face a mask of shocked disbelief. He had lost. He knew it. The sheriff knew it. Even his drunken friends knew it. The fight was over. Sheriff Jenkins, a man who had built a career on looking the other way, finally saw which way the wind was blowing. A public domestic dispute was one thing, but attempted murder, conspiracy to steal property, those were things that could cost him his badge. He drew his pistol. Roy Cutter, he said, his voice flat and official. You're under arrest. Roy looked from the sheriff's gun to Caroline's rifle, to the mountain man standing like a stone sentinel beside her. The trap had closed. He didn't resist as the sheriff put him in irons. He just stared at Caroline, his eyes full of a pathetic, venomous hatred. As they led him away, a broken and defeated man, the sun finally broke over the mountaintops, flooding the valley with brilliant, clean light. In the aftermath, the silence that fell was one of peace. The sheriff, in a rare moment of competence, took detailed statements, and even seemed embarrassed by his own inaction over the years. He promised to look into the matter of the deed and the hidden gold. But Caroline knew it didn't matter. The real treasure wasn't buried under the hearth. It was standing right in front of her. As the lawman disappeared down the trail with Roy in tow, she turned to Jedediah. The cabin was a wreck. The door was splintered, the ceiling had a hole in it, but it felt more like a home than it ever had before. I don't know how to thank you, she said, her voice thick with emotion. He just gave a small, weary smile. You fought your own battle, Caroline. I just held the rifle. He looked around the valley, now bathed in morning sun. You and the children will be safe now. I should be getting back to the mountains. A pang of loss, sharp and unexpected, struck Caroline. She couldn't imagine this cabin, this life, without his quiet strength in it. Will you go? Luke asked, his small voice trembling as he clutched the wooden bird Jedediah had carved for him. Jedediah knelt down, his expression softening as he looked at the boy. He glanced up at Caroline, a question in his deep, dark eyes. A question that had nothing to do with gold or land or safety, and everything to do with the future. A future that suddenly seemed vast and full of possibility. Caroline looked at her children, their faces bright and fearless in the morning light. She looked at the cabin, no longer a prison, but a shelter she had defended. And she looked at the mountain man who had walked out of the storm and shown her how to find the strength she always had inside her. She smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached her eyes for the first time in a decade. Why don't you stay? She asked. For a little while. There's a roof that needs patching. Jedediah Boone looked at the family he had accidentally made his own, and for the first time in a long, long time, the ghost of his past settled. He wasn't running anymore. He was home. The story of Caroline May and the Mountain Man became a legend in Dry Creek, a cautionary tale about underestimating the quiet ones. They never found a great fortune under the hearth, just a small box of silver coins and a new life, which turned out to be worth a whole lot more. Justice doesn't always come like a thunderclap. Sometimes it comes quietly, on soft feet in the middle of a snowstorm. It comes in the form of a stranger who reminds you that no one deserves to be broken, and that even in the deepest, darkest winter, you can fight your way back to the sun. If you were moved by this story of courage and redemption, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. You never know when you'll need a reminder that even one person can make all the difference.